The snow fell like God's judgment on Montana territory that December evening in 1910, each flake catching the amber glow from the oil lamps in Thomas Brennan's parlor. At 77, his hands bore the permanent stains of honest work. Rope burns from Mustang Broncos that had tested his will, cattle brands that had marked both hide and handler, scars from barbed wire that had revolutionized ranching but demanded its tribute in blood, and the deeper marks that came from building something lasting in a land that broke most men who dared to try. The parlor itself told the story of 3 decades of prosperity earned through sweat and stubborn determination. Hand-hewn timber beams supported a ceiling that had weathered countless Montana storms. The stone fireplace, built from rocks Thomas had hauled himself from Copper Creek, threw dancing shadows across walls lined with photographs spanning 34 years, cattle drives and county fairs, church socials, and harvest celebrations, the accumulated evidence of a life well lived despite its dark beginnings. His grandson Michael sat cross-legged on the braided rug his grandmother Lucy had woven from wool sheared from their own sheep, 10 years old and hungry for stories the way boys that age always were. The child possessed the restless energy of youth barely contained by winter's enforced confinement, his eyes constantly seeking adventure in a world that seemed determined to keep him indoors and safe. Those same eyes kept drifting to the music box on the mantelpiece, its brass corners dulled by decades of handling, its wooden surface worn smooth by fingers that had learned to find comfort in small, precious things during times when comfort was scarce as spring water in August. "Grandpa, why do you keep that old music box? It doesn't even play anymore. Mama's got a new phonograph that plays real music, not just one little song over and over." Lucy Morrison Brennan looked up from her needlework, her 43-year-old fingers still nimble with the domestic arts that frontier women mastered by necessity rather than choice. The lamplight caught the silver threads that had begun appearing in her brown hair, premature perhaps, but earned through years of managing a ranch operation that now encompassed 5,000 acres and employed 15 full-time hands. Her needle paused mid-stitch as she considered her son's question, understanding that some stories required careful timing and the right audience. "That's a long story, Michael. Maybe too long for a school night. You've got arithmetic and geography waiting for you tomorrow morning, and Mrs. Henderson doesn't accept Grandpa told stories past bedtime as an excuse for unprepared lessons." Thomas settled deeper into his leather chair, the one he'd built himself 30 years ago when his back was stronger and his future less certain. The chair had aged with him, its surface polished smooth by countless evenings like this one, its frame solid as the man who'd crafted it from oak trees that had grown on his own land. Outside, the wind tested the windows with the persistence of something that had traveled 1,000 miles across empty prairie just to rattle the glass in this particular house on this particular night. The wind carried memories, as wind always did in Montana. It whispered of cattle drives and Indian raids, of boom towns that had flourished and died, of fortunes made and lost in the span of a single season. But tonight it seemed to carry something more specific, a reminder of another winter night 34 years past, when the same wind had brought death and salvation in equal measure. "Some stories are worth the telling," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom and the careful cadence of a man who had learned to choose his words with precision, "especially when they're true, especially when they're about family. And most especially when they're about how families sometimes get made in ways that don't follow any rules the preacher ever taught from his pulpit." The boy's attention sharpened instantly. Family stories were different from the tales other adults told. They weren't just entertainment designed to fill idle hours. They were inheritance, legacy, the accumulated wisdom of generations passed down like heirloom jewelry or carefully preserved tools. They carried weight and responsibility. The understanding that someday Michael would be expected to tell these same stories to his own children, adding his own chapters to the ongoing narrative of the Brennan family. Thomas reached for the music box, his movements careful and deliberate. Age had taught him to respect the fragility of precious things, to handle memories with the same gentle attention he'd once reserved for newborn calves or injured birds. The weight of the box in his hands transported him instantly back across 34 years, to a time when Montana was still territory instead of state, when justice was something a man had to make for himself with rifle and rope, and the kind of stubborn courage that frontier life demanded from anyone who hoped to survive its testing. This box belonged to a little girl named Lucy, he began, then caught himself with the small smile of a man who had nearly stepped into his own trap. Well, she wasn't just any little girl. He looked toward his daughter, the woman who had kept his name even after marriage, who had given him grandchildren and purpose, and a reason to believe that some broken things could indeed be mended, given enough time and patience and love. She was the best thing that ever happened to this old fool, though I was too stubborn and scared to know it at the time. Michael shifted closer to the chair, drawn by the gravity in his grandfather's voice and the way the firelight played across the old man's weathered features. In the dancing shadows, Thomas looked younger somehow, as if the act of remembering had temporarily restored some portion of the man he'd been, when the world was wider and more dangerous and full of possibilities that seemed as vast as the Montana sky. It was February of 1876. I was 43 then, thought I knew everything there was to know about loss and loneliness and the way life had of grinding a man down until he wondered why he bothered getting up each morning to face another day of empty routine. The words carried the weight of remembered pain, the kind of grief that becomes part of a man's bones and changes the way he moves through the world. Thomas paused, allowing the weight of that statement to settle over the room like dust after a cattle drive. The Battle of Little Bighorn had happened 6 months earlier, and the whole territory was on edge. Custer and his men wiped out to the last man, Indians and cavalry trading atrocities like they were playing some kind of deadly card game where the stakes kept getting higher and the rules kept changing. Everyone looking over their shoulders, everyone expecting trouble to come riding over the next hill with war paint and Winchester rifles. The historical context mattered, Thomas knew. Michael lived in a world of automobiles and electric lights, of telegraphs and railroads that connected Montana to the broader civilization. But in 1800, the frontier had still been frontier in the truest sense, a place where a man's survival depended on his own skills and weapons and the quality of his horses, where the nearest law might be 100 miles away and help even farther. The Northern Pacific Railway was pushing west, bringing civilization and Eastern money and the kind of men who wore suits and carried leather briefcases full of contracts that could change a territory overnight. Gold rushes were playing out, but smart money was moving into copper and silver, minerals that required more capital but promised steadier returns for men with the patience and resources to develop proper mining operations. Thomas shifted in his chair, his old bones protesting the winter cold despite the warmth of the fire. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the house, testing joints and weather stripping with the patient persistence of water wearing away stone. I owned 1,200 acres then, ran about 150 head of Hereford cattle on range that stretched from Copper Creek to the foothills of the Bear Paw Mountains. Not the biggest operation in the territory, but it was mine. Every acre of it paid for with blood and sweat and the kind of determination that comes from having nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. He paused, letting the boss absorb the weight of that statement. Michael had never known want, never understood what it meant to build something from nothing, to risk everything on the chance that hard work and stubborn determination might be enough to overcome the 1,000 ways the frontier could kill a man's dreams. Built it all with these hands after the war, after I came back from Sherman's March to the Sea with nothing but a discharge paper and the kind of dreams young men have before the world teaches them the difference between hoping and surviving. The memories of the Civil War remain vivid even after more than a decade, sharp-edged and dangerous as broken glass. Thomas had learned early that some experiences never truly ended. They just went underground, surfacing at unexpected moments to remind a man of what he'd seen and done in service of causes larger than himself. Served as a cavalry sergeant in the Union Army, learned to fight and lead and make decisions when other men's lives hung in the balance. Sherman believed in total war, in bringing the conflict home to civilians who supported the Confederate cause. We burned farms and railways, destroyed food supplies and manufacturing centers, left a trail of destruction from Atlanta to the sea that you could smell for miles in any direction. Thomas's voice grew quiet, reflective. War stories required careful handling, especially when told to children who'd never seen violence beyond schoolyard scuffles. War teaches a man things he'd rather not know about himself and his fellow human beings. It shows you what people will do when they're desperate, how quickly civilization falls away when survival is at stake. But it also teaches practical skills: how to treat wounds and set bones, how to read terrain and weather, how to judge character under pressure, and make alliances with men you can trust to watch your back when the shooting starts. The boy listened with the intense concentration of someone trying to imagine experiences completely outside his own peaceful existence. Michael's wars were fought with wooden soldiers and imagination. His grandfather's had been conducted with real bullets and real consequences. But by 1876, I wasn't so young anymore. Lost my wife Catherine and my little girl Annie to cholera in '73. 3 years I'd been alone on that ranch, and the loneliness was eating me alive like some kind of slow poison that got worse instead of better as time passed. Thomas's voice caught slightly, as it always did when he mentioned his first family. Time had dulled the sharp edge of grief, but never eliminated it entirely. Catherine and Annie remained permanent residents of his heart, their absence a constant reminder of how quickly happiness could be torn away by circumstances beyond any man's control. Catherine was 28 when the cholera took her, most beautiful woman in 3 counties, with a laugh that could make you forget whatever troubles were weighing on your mind. Annie was 7, bright as summer sunshine and twice as energetic. Used to follow me around the ranch asking questions about everything she saw, wanting to know how cattle found their way home and why horses slept standing up and whether the stars really were holes in the sky like the preacher claimed. The firelight danced across Thomas's face as he spoke, illuminating features carved by decades of outdoor work and hard decisions. His hands, gnarled now with arthritis but still strong, gestured unconsciously as he painted pictures with words. Had 3 good men working for me then: old Pete, who'd been a mountain man before the beaver played out and civilization pushed west past the profitable trapping grounds; Carlos Martinez, who knew more about cattle than any vaquero from here to Mexico and could gentle the wildest Mustang with nothing but patience and sugar cubes; and Jimmy Sullivan, just 19 but willing to work 16-hour days for wages that barely covered his room and board. Each of these men had earned his place in the story through loyalty and competence during years when both qualities were more valuable than gold. Frontier ranching required absolute trust among crew members. A moment's hesitation or betrayal could mean the difference between a successful cattle drive and disaster that would bankrupt an operation. Old Pete had seen the territory when it was nothing but buffalo and Indians, when a white man could travel for weeks without seeing another human soul. He'd trapped with Jim Bridger and Hugh Glass, survived 3 Indian attacks and 2 grizzly encounters, and could read weather signs like some men read newspapers. If Pete said a storm was coming, you battened down for a storm. If he said the creek was going to flood, you moved the cattle to higher ground. Thomas smiled as he remembered the old mountain man, dead now these 15 years, but still vivid in memory. Carlos had learned his trade on the great ranches of Texas and Mexico, where cattle operations covered millions of acres and vaqueros developed their skills through generations of tradition. He could throw a lasso with supernatural accuracy, ride anything with 4 legs and a heartbeat, and had an intuitive understanding of cattle psychology that bordered on telepathy. Outside, the February wind picked up intensity, and Thomas paused until the house stopped creaking, understanding that even nature demanded respect during important conversations. Jimmy was local, son of Irish immigrants who'd tried farming before discovering that Montana soil and climate weren't designed for the kind of agriculture they'd practiced in the old country. Good with horses and eager to learn, the kind of young man who might have made a fine ranch foreman given time and proper training. But time, Thomas reflected, had a way of making its own plans regardless of human intentions. The events of 1876 had scattered his carefully assembled crew to the winds, some to other ranches and other territories, some to graves that marked the price of loyalty in a violent age. February 15th, 1876. The day that changed everything, though I didn't know it at the time. We had a blizzard coming in from the northwest, the kind that kills cattle if you don't get them to shelter, and kills men if they're foolish enough to get caught in the open without proper preparation. Thomas closed his eyes and Michael could see him traveling backward through time, his weathered face becoming something younger and harder, a man who had learned violence in the service of the Union and had never quite forgotten how to use it when circumstances demanded such skills. Weather prediction was more art than science in those days. No telegraph warnings or government forecasters, just the accumulated wisdom of men who'd learned to read the sky like scripture and trust their bones when atmospheric pressures started dropping. The morning sky had that peculiar yellow-gray color that veteran plainsmen associated with serious trouble, and the wind carried the metallic smell of snow coming fast and hard. The technical details mattered, Thomas knew. Michael's generation took weather prediction for granted, never understanding how vulnerable earlier generations had been to atmospheric violence that could appear without warning and kill with impersonal efficiency. Wind was howling at 35 miles an hour by late afternoon, temperature already 20 below, and dropping fast enough that you could feel it changing minute by minute. The kind of cold that could freeze exposed skin in under 10 minutes, that made horses' breath crystallize instantly and turn spit solid before it hit the ground. Thomas paused, allowing his audience to imagine such brutal conditions. I was out checking the fence line, making sure the herd hadn't drifted too far from the home pasture. Range cattle have an instinct for finding shelter during storms, but sometimes that instinct leads them into draws and ravines where they can freeze to death, huddled together for warmth that never comes. The old man's voice took on the measured cadence of someone recounting events that had been rehearsed in memory countless times over the decades. I was riding my Morgan horse, Ranger, 16 hands of solid muscle and good sense, with enough trail experience to find his way home in weather that would confuse lesser animals. Morgans were cavalry horses, bred for endurance and intelligence, the kind of mount that could carry a man through hell and still have strength left for the return journey. Michael tried to picture his grandfather as a younger man, mounted on a powerful horse and battling the elements with the same determination he'd later apply to building a ranching empire. The snow was coming down so thick you couldn't see 20 yards in any direction. Visibility was like looking through gauze curtains that kept getting thicker, making familiar landmarks disappear and reappear, like mirages. That's probably why I almost missed them. Thomas's voice dropped slightly, building tension as he approached the crucial moment of the narrative. Two shapes in the snow, about 200 yards from my main gate, partially concealed by a stand of cottonwood trees that provided minimal shelter from the horizontal wind. At first I thought they might be deer, or maybe wolves that had denned up to wait out the storm. But something about the way they lay there wasn't right. Wolves don't huddle together like that when they're hunting, and deer would have bolted long before I got close enough to see them clearly. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny prayers ascending into the darkness. Outside, the contemporary blizzard seemed to echo the storm Thomas was describing, as if weather itself possessed memory and was determined to recreate the conditions that had changed so many lives 34 years earlier. I dismounted about 50 yards away and walked closer, leading Ranger behind me. Horse sense is better than human sense in most situations, and Ranger's ears were pricked forward with interest rather than alarm, which told me whatever we'd found wasn't immediately dangerous. His wartime instincts guided his cautious approach, evaluating risks that could determine success or disaster of the storm. That's when I saw what they really were, a woman and a child, both of them nearly frozen to death, but still alive enough to matter. The woman was maybe 32, 33 years old, with dark hair matted with ice and snow, wearing a wool coat that had probably been warm enough for normal winter weather, but was completely inadequate for blizzard conditions. The image crystallized in Thomas's memory as he spoke, becoming more vivid rather than less with the passage of time. She was pretty, even with her lips blue from the cold and ice crystals forming in her hair. High cheekbones that suggested mixed heritage, maybe Irish and Indian, like so many frontier families where survival mattered more than racial purity. Her hands were bare, fingers already showing the white patches that indicated serious frostbite, but she was still conscious enough to respond when I knelt beside her. Thomas paused, his weathered hands unconsciously mimicking the movements of that long-ago examination. The child was 9 years old, a little girl with blonde braids and the biggest green eyes I'd ever seen. She was wearing a dress more suitable for Sunday church than winter travel, with thin cotton stockings and leather shoes that provided no protection against the cold. But she was alert, watching me with a mixture of hope and terror that suggested she'd already seen more than any child should have to see. Michael found himself holding his breath, completely absorbed in the drama unfolding in his grandfather's words. The woman was barely conscious, hypothermia taking her fast, but she managed to grab my coat when I knelt down beside her, her frozen fingers clinging to the wool with desperate strength. "Jeremiah," she whispered, and I had to lean close to hear her over the wind that was trying to steal her words before they could reach my ears. Thomas's voice became softer, more intimate, as he recounted the dying woman's final message. "He put arsenic in my coffee. 3 months now. Don't let him take Lucy's land. Copper claims worth fortune." Her words were broken by the cold and weakness, but the meaning was clear enough. Someone had been poisoning her systematically, and now that someone wanted to claim whatever property she was trying to protect. The music box seemed to glow in the lamplight as Thomas reached for it with reverent hands. Then she pressed this into my hands, this music box, and said, "Promise me, protect her. The truth is inside." Her eyes were already glazing over, life draining away like water through sand, but she held on long enough to make sure I understood what she was asking. Thomas's voice caught slightly, the way it always did at this part of the story. 34 years later, and he could still feel the weight of that dying woman's fingers on his coat, still hear the desperation in her voice as she entrusted her most precious possession to a complete stranger. Her name was Margaret Sullivan, though I didn't know it then. The child was Lucy, 9 years old and so scared she couldn't speak. Margaret died in my arms about 2 hours later, after I'd gotten them both back to the house and tried everything I knew from my war experience to warm them up and save their lives. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and Lucy looked up from her sewing with tears glistening in her eyes. She had heard this story countless times, but it never failed to move her. The moment of her rescue, the instant when her life had taken a turn towards something better, remained as vivid and emotionally powerful as if it had happened yesterday instead of decades ago. But Margaret was too far gone, had been sick for too long before the exposure finished what someone else had started. The arsenic had weakened her system, made her vulnerable to conditions that a healthy person might have survived with proper treatment. Thomas paused, allowing the tragedy of Margaret's death to register fully with his audience before continuing. Lucy wouldn't let go of that music box, clutched it like it was the only real thing left in the world, which maybe it was for her at that point. She couldn't talk, couldn't eat without constant coaxing, couldn't sleep without nightmares that made her cry out in terror. Just a little girl who'd watched her mother die slowly and didn't understand why the world had suddenly become such a terrible, dangerous place. Michael's imagination was working overtime now, trying to picture his beloved Aunt Lucy as a traumatized child, trying to understand how the confident, capable woman he knew had emerged from such darkness and pain. I had a choice to make, and it was the kind of choice that defines a man's character for the rest of his life. I could have taken her to town, turned her over to whoever passed for social services in those days, which usually meant the church or some well-meaning family that already had more mouths to feed than they could properly manage. Thomas's voice took on the weight of moral complexity, the understanding that easy answers rarely existed when human suffering was involved. Could have walked away clean, gone back to my cattle and my loneliness and my carefully ordered routine, pretended I'd never heard a dying woman's last words or seen the terror in a child's eyes. Would have been the practical thing to do, the sensible thing for a man who was already struggling financially and had no experience raising children alone. The wind outside seemed to echo the storm Thomas was describing, as if weather itself possessed memory and was determined to recreate the conditions that had changed so many lives. But Margaret had said something about copper claims, about someone named Jeremiah who'd been poisoning her for months. And looking at that little girl, seeing the terror in her eyes whenever she heard a man's voice, I knew she'd witnessed things no child should ever see. Knew that whoever had killed her mother might not be finished with his work. Thomas leaned forward in his chair, his voice taking on the intensity of a man reliving a moment that had changed everything. More than that, though, I remembered Annie. Remembered how she used to look at me with complete trust. How she'd climb into my lap for bedtime stories and fall asleep knowing that nothing bad could touch her while her father was watching. And I thought about how I'd failed to protect Annie from the cholera, How helpless I'd felt watching her die, while doctors shook their heads and admitted they had no cure for the disease that was taking her away from me. The parallel between his lost daughter and the rescued child was obvious, but Thomas had needed 34 years to fully understand its significance. Maybe this was God's way of giving me a second chance, an opportunity to save a child when I'd been unable to save my own. Maybe it was just coincidence, two broken people thrown together by circumstances beyond their control. But looking at Lucy that night, seeing her clutch that music box like it contained her last hope for happiness, I knew I couldn't walk away. Thomas settled back in his chair, his decision made all those years ago but still carrying weight in the retelling. 3 days later, he showed up. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Thomas's voice hardened with remembered anger and disgust. February 18th, 8 in the morning. I was in the barn checking on a mare that was due to full, routine work that helped keep my hands busy while my mind wrestled with questions about Lucy's future and my own responsibilities. That's when I heard horses outside, multiple animals approaching at a businesslike trot. Thomas paused for dramatic effect, allowing the tension to build. 3 men dismounted in my yard, a well-dressed fellow in Eastern clothes that probably cost more than most ranchers earned in a year, Sheriff William Garrett looking uncomfortable and official, and Deputy Tom Walsh with his hand resting casually on his gun butt like he expected trouble. The description painted a picture of authority arriving with predetermined conclusions and the force to back them up. The well-dressed one stepped forward like he owned the place, removing an expensive hat and smoothing hair that had been recently barbered and pomaded. "Mr. Brennan," he said, extending a manicured hand that had never known serious manual labor. "I'm Jeremiah Blackwood, Margaret Sullivan's older brother and Lucy's only surviving relative." Thomas's voice took on the smooth, confident tone of a man accustomed to getting his way through charm and intimidation. He was maybe 48 years old, medium height, but carrying himself with the kind of authority that came from money and social position. Expensive wool coat, leather gloves, boots that had been custom-made by craftsmen who understood that appearances could be more important than function in certain circles. The contrast between Jeremiah's polished appearance and the rough practicality of ranch life was deliberate and meaningful. But it was his eyes that bothered me most, cold and calculating, the kind of eyes that evaluated everything in terms of profit and loss, that looked at people like they were just another resource to be managed or exploited. I'd seen eyes like that during the war, usually on the faces of men who'd learned to profit from other people's suffering. Thomas's military experience provided him with insights into character that civilian life might not have developed. Sheriff Garrett cleared his throat and stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with his role in whatever was happening. "Mr. Brennan, Mr. Blackwood here has legal documents establishing his relationship to the deceased woman and his right to take custody of the child." The sheriff's discomfort suggested that he had doubts about the situation, but was bound by legal obligations he couldn't ignore. Jeremiah produced a leather portfolio thick with official-looking papers, guardianship documents bearing territorial seals, property deeds with multiple signatures and witness marks, even a letter supposedly from Margaret asking her brother to take care of Lucy if anything happened to her. Thomas's voice conveyed his immediate suspicion about documents that seemed too convenient and too complete. The papers looked professional, expensive, the kind of legal work that cost serious money and required connections with influential people. But something about them bothered me immediately. They were too perfect, too comprehensive, like someone had spent considerable time and effort preparing for exactly this situation. The old man's instincts, honed by years of evaluating men in situations under pressure, had recognized danger even when he couldn't yet identify its specific nature. The guardianship letter was dated February 10th, just 5 days before Margaret died. But according to what I'd learned from old Pete's inquiries in town, she'd been too sick to travel anywhere for at least 3 weeks. And the handwriting, Thomas shook his head with remembered disgust. Margaret could barely write her own name, according to Pastor Morrison, who'd known the family. This letter was in perfect cursive script, the kind they teach in expensive Eastern schools. The forgery was obvious to anyone who looked carefully, but Jeremiah was counting on authority and intimidation to prevent close examination. Worse than the suspicious documents, though, was Lucy's reaction. The moment she saw Jeremiah through the kitchen window, she went completely rigid with terror, hid behind my legs like a frightened animal and wouldn't come out, wouldn't even look at him directly. Thomas's voice softened as he remembered the child's obvious fear. I'd seen that kind of terror before during the war. It's what people look like when they're face to face with someone who's tried to kill them, someone who represents their worst nightmares made flesh. Lucy's reaction told me more about Jeremiah's true character than all his fancy papers and smooth words combined. The child's instinctive recognition of danger provided crucial evidence that couldn't be forged or fabricated. Jeremiah had his story all worked out, rehearsed and polished like a stage performance. Said Margaret had been mentally unstable since her husband died in a mining accident 2 years earlier. Claimed she'd been hearing voices and acting irrationally for months before her death. Thomas's voice took on the oily smoothness of a confident liar working his trade. He even had witnesses lined up, respectable citizens from Helena, who swore Margaret had been behaving strangely during her last few visits to town. Talking about people following her, claiming someone was trying to steal her land, the kind of paranoid delusions that might explain why she died alone in a blizzard with her terrified daughter. The conspiracy was broader and more sophisticated than Thomas had initially realized, involving multiple people and careful preparation over an extended period. But I'd heard Margaret's dying words, and they hadn't sounded like the ramblings of a madwoman. They'd been specific, detailed, desperate attempts to protect her child from someone she knew was dangerous. And Lucy's terror when she saw Jeremiah only confirmed that Margaret's fears had been justified. Thomas's voice grew hard as he remembered the confrontation that had followed. Sheriff Garrett was caught in an impossible position. Territorial law was pretty clear about blood relatives having presumptive rights over strangers, and Jeremiah's documents looked legitimate enough to satisfy legal requirements. But he'd also taken Margaret's dying declaration from me under oath, and he could see with his own eyes how frightened Lucy was. The sheriff's dilemma illustrated the conflict between legal procedure and practical justice that characterized much of frontier law enforcement. Garrett was a good man, honest as they came, and genuinely concerned about doing the right thing. He'd been sheriff for 8 years, had earned respect by treating people fairly regardless of their social status or financial situation. But he was also bound by territorial law and the authority of properly executed legal documents. Thomas respected men who tried to do their jobs honorably, even when circumstances made honor a complicated concept. After maybe 20 minutes of awkward conversation and document examination, Garrett made his decision. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "I'm going to grant you 30 days temporary custody while we investigate this situation more thoroughly. If you can prove that Mr. Blackwood isn't who he claims to be, or if you can demonstrate that Lucy would be better off in your care, I'll consider alternative arrangements." The temporary custody order provided breathing room, but also established a deadline that would drive subsequent events. But he also had to respect Jeremiah's apparent rights as next of kin. "Mr. Blackwood, you'll be allowed supervised visitation every Sunday afternoon, 1 hour at a time, until this matter is resolved to everyone's satisfaction." The compromise satisfied no one completely, but provided a framework for proceeding within legal boundaries. Jeremiah's reaction to the sheriff's decision told me everything I needed to know about his true character. For just a moment, his polished mask slipped, and I saw genuine rage underneath, the kind of fury that comes from having carefully laid plans disrupted by unexpected obstacles. Thomas had learned to read micro-expressions during his military service, when the ability to judge men quickly could mean the difference between life and death. But he recovered quickly, forcing his face back into an expression of reasonable disappointment. "Of course, Sheriff Garrett, I understand your caution in this matter. The welfare of my niece must be our primary concern." The false concern was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for, but Jeremiah was skilled at presenting whatever face the situation required. As they prepared to leave, Jeremiah approached me with what he probably thought was a friendly smile. "Mr. Brennan, I appreciate your concern for Lucy, truly I do. But she belongs with family, with people who understand her background and can provide for her future in ways that—" He let the sentence hang unfinished, the implication clear that a failing ranch owner couldn't offer what a successful businessman could provide. The veiled threat was delivered with surface politeness, but unmistakable underlying menace. Then he knelt down to Lucy's level, trying to project avuncular warmth despite the obvious terror his presence caused. "Hello, sweetheart. Uncle Jeremiah is here to take care of you, just like your mama would have wanted. We're going to be such good friends, you and I." Lucy's violent reaction to Jeremiah's approach had been immediate and unmistakable. The child became completely hysterical, screaming and clinging to my leg with strength that seemed impossible for someone so small. Her terror was so obvious, so genuine, that even Deputy Walsh looked uncomfortable with the situation. The child's instinctive rejection of her supposed uncle provided powerful evidence of his true nature. Jeremiah's mask slipped again for just a moment, and I saw something ugly cross his features before he regained control. "She's been through terrible trauma," he said smoothly. "Once she's had time to adjust and remember our family connection, everything will be fine." The threat implicit in those words was clear to anyone who understood the subtext of power and control. After they left, I spent the afternoon thinking about what I'd learned and what it might mean for Lucy's future. Jeremiah's story was plausible enough on the surface, but the details didn't add up when examined carefully, and Lucy's reaction suggested she knew things about her supposed uncle that contradicted his carefully constructed narrative. Thomas had learned to trust his instincts about people, and everything about Jeremiah triggered warning signals that couldn't be ignored. But 30 days wasn't much time to prove a negative, especially when the man I was fighting had money and connections and legal documents that looked authentic enough to fool most people. I needed help, and I needed it fast. The deadline created urgency that would drive all subsequent decisions and actions. That's when I started building what would become the most important alliance of my life. The first person Thomas turned to was Dr. Samuel Whitman, and that decision would prove more crucial than he could have imagined at the time. Dr. Whitman lived in a modest frame house on the outskirts of town, close enough to respond to medical emergencies, but far enough from the main settlement to maintain the privacy that frontier doctors often required for their more delicate work. The house itself reflected the man, practical, well-maintained, and equipped with the tools of a profession that demanded both scientific knowledge and frontier improvisation. Samuel Whitman was 58 years old in 1876, a man whose silver beard and careful movements spoke of experience earned through decades of treating everything from gunshot wounds to childhood diseases in conditions that would have challenged physicians with access to modern hospitals and equipment. He had served as a Union Army surgeon during the war, stationed at field hospitals where he had learned to perform amputations by candlelight and treat massive trauma with limited supplies and unlimited determination. The doctor's medical bag was a leather case that had seen service from Antietam to Appomattox, its surface scarred by years of emergency calls and field surgery. Inside, carefully maintained instruments reflected his commitment to professional standards even in the wilderness. Bone saws and bullet extractors, forceps and sutures, bottles of chloroform and morphine that represented the cutting edge of 1870s pain management. But more valuable than any tool was the knowledge he'd accumulated through treating frontier ailments that medical schools never covered in their curriculum. "Thomas," Dick Whitman said when he answered the door that February evening, "you look like a man carrying heavy thoughts. Come in, warm yourself by the fire, and tell me what's troubling you." Thomas explained the situation carefully, beginning with the rescue during the blizzard and ending with Jeremiah's appearance and the suspicious circumstances surrounding his claim to guardianship. Dr. Whitman listened without interruption, his experienced eyes studying Thomas's face for signs of deception or emotional instability that might color his account of events. "You mentioned that Margaret spoke of being poisoned," Dr. Whitman said when Thomas finished his narrative. "That's a serious accusation, one that would require careful medical examination to substantiate or disprove. If you're willing to trust my professional judgment, I'd like to examine Margaret's remains before the ground thaws and conditions deteriorate further." 3 days later, Dr. Whitman completed his examination and arrived at Jacob Ironwood's forge with evidence that would change everything. The forge had become their unofficial headquarters, a place where they could meet without attracting the attention that gatherings at the church or Thomas's ranch might generate. Jacob understood the value of discretion and had arranged the workspace to accommodate serious conversations while maintaining the appearance of normal business activities. "Gentlemen," Dr. Whitman began, his voice carrying the weight of professional certainty, "Margaret Sullivan was murdered, I've found clear evidence of systematic arsenic poisoning administered over a period of approximately 3 months. The doctor opened his medical bag and withdrew a collection of small glass vials containing samples that would provide irrefutable proof of criminal activity. Arsenic concentrates in hair and fingernails during chronic exposure, creating patterns that are impossible to fake or explain through accidental contact. Margaret's hair shows arsenic levels 15 times higher than normal background exposure, with concentration increasing steadily over the 3 months preceding her death. Dr. Whitman held up a vial containing hair samples that had been carefully preserved and labeled according to scientific procedures. More conclusively, bone marrow analysis reveals arsenic sulfide concentrations of 12 parts per million. Normal levels never exceed zero point 0.5 parts per million, and acute poisoning cases rarely show levels above 5 parts per million. Margaret was systematically poisoned with doses carefully calculated to cause gradual deterioration that would mimic natural illness. The scientific evidence was incontrovertible, providing proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away through alternative theories. The timeline corresponds exactly with Jeremiah's visits to the Sullivan homestead. According to neighbors' testimony, Margaret's health declined noticeably after each of his appearances, with symptoms that included hair loss, fingernail changes, skin discoloration, and gastrointestinal distress that worsened progressively over 3 months. Thomas felt a cold fury building in his chest as the full scope of Jeremiah's calculated cruelty became clear. This hadn't been a crime of passion or desperation. It had been methodical torture designed to maximize suffering while minimizing suspicion. But Doctor, Pastor Morrison interjected, will territorial authorities accept this evidence? Jeremiah has money and connections that might allow him to challenge scientific findings or question your methodology. Dr. Whitman's expression grew grim as he considered the political dimensions of their situation. You raise an important point, Pastor. Scientific evidence is only as strong as the system that evaluates it, and territorial courts aren't always receptive to testimony that challenges the interests of wealthy and influential defendants. The doctor paused, organizing his thoughts before continuing with information that would prove even more disturbing. However, my preliminary investigation suggests Margaret Sullivan wasn't Jeremiah's only victim. I've been corresponding with medical colleagues throughout the territory, and we've identified at least 6 confirmed cases over the past 2 years, with several more suspicious deaths requiring further investigation. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow, transforming their understanding of the situation from an isolated crime to something far more sinister and widespread. In each case, unknown relatives appeared shortly after the deaths with legal documents establishing their inheritance rights. These supposed family members then sold the disputed properties to mining companies for substantial profits before disappearing to other territories where the pattern could be repeated. Jacob Ironwood's massive hands clenched into fists as the implications became clear. You're talking about organized murder for profit, Doctor. A conspiracy that extends far beyond one man's greed to include multiple killers, corrupt officials, and Eastern business interests with the resources to buy whatever services they require. Dr. Whitman nodded soberly. Exactly. And based on my research, the total value of properties acquired through these methods exceeds $3 million. We're not fighting a simple guardianship dispute. We're confronting a criminal enterprise that has successfully operated across multiple territories for at least 2 years. Thomas understood that the scope of the conspiracy made their fight both more dangerous and more important. If they succeeded in exposing Jeremiah, they might save not just Lucy but dozens of other potential victims who didn't yet know they were being targeted. Pastor Morrison had been examining Jeremiah's legal documents with the careful attention that his educational background allowed, and his findings provided additional evidence of the sophisticated nature of the criminal enterprise they were confronting. These documents are masterfully forged, Pastor Morrison announced during their next meeting. The paper, ink, and notarization appear authentic at first glance, but careful examination reveals inconsistencies that prove they were created through criminal means. The pastor spread the documents across Jacob's workbench, pointing to specific details that supported his conclusions. The guardianship letter is supposedly written in Margaret's handwriting, but I have samples of her actual writing from church records that show completely different letter formations and spelling patterns. Margaret had received only basic education and struggled with complex words, But this letter uses sophisticated vocabulary and perfect grammar that she never demonstrated in her authentic correspondence. Pastor Morrison produced several genuine letters that Margaret had written to church officials, providing clear evidence of the forgery. More importantly, the notarization was supposedly performed by a territorial official in Helena, but I've confirmed through church correspondence that the official in question was attending a conference in Denver during the week when this document was allegedly notarized. The pastor's investigation had revealed procedural irregularities that could be verified through official records and witness testimony. The property deeds show similar problems. They reference survey markers and boundary descriptions that don't match the original homestead filing, suggesting they were created by someone who had access to general land office records but lacked intimate knowledge of the actual property. Pastor Morrison's analysis provided additional grounds for challenging Jeremiah's legal claim and demonstrated the criminal nature of his activities. Jacob Ironwood's investigation into Jeremiah's financial background was revealing connections that extended far beyond the local community and involved some of the most powerful economic interests in the territory. Your Mr. Blackwood has been receiving regular payments from the Consolidated Mining Corporation of New York, Jacob reported, producing banking records that had been obtained through his network of contacts throughout the territory. The amounts are substantial: $5,000 in December, $3,000 in January, and another $5,000 just last week. The financial evidence provided clear proof of Jeremiah's connection to Eastern business interests and suggested that his activities were part of a coordinated effort to acquire valuable properties through fraudulent means. Consolidated Mining has been particularly active in acquiring copper claims throughout Montana Territory, often through intermediaries who specialize in negotiating with reluctant property owners. Their methods have been questioned by territorial authorities, but their political connections have prevented serious investigation. Jacob's discoveries indicated that confronting Jeremiah would require challenging not just an individual criminal, but an entire network of corrupt officials and economic interests that profited from such schemes. I've also learned that several territorial officials who would normally be responsible for investigating such cases have received substantial loans from banks associated with Consolidated Mining. The corruption extends high enough into the territorial government that we can't rely on normal legal channels to provide justice. The revelation about official corruption explained why previous cases hadn't been properly investigated and suggested that alternative strategies would be required to bring Jeremiah to justice. Chief Running Bear's arrival at the ranch with information about Lucy's heritage would provide the legal breakthrough that Thomas's alliance had been seeking, but it also revealed complications that would require careful navigation of federal law and tribal politics. "Thomas Brennan," Chief Running Bear said as he dismounted from his horse with the dignity that marked all his movements, "I bring news that will change the legal situation for the child you are protecting, but it will also create new challenges that you must be prepared to face." The chief had arrived with two tribal elders who carried leather cases containing documents that represented decades of careful record-keeping by people who understood the importance of preserving their history and legal rights. Margaret Sullivan's mother was White Dove, daughter of Chief Mountain Wind, who signed the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. According to tribal records and federal documentation, this makes Lucy a legitimate member of the Blackfoot Nation with rights that supersede territorial law. Chief Running Bear produced a collection of documents that included birth certificates, marriage records, and tribal enrollment papers that established Lucy's lineage beyond any possible challenge. Under federal treaty law, property disputes involving tribal members must be adjudicated through federal courts rather than territorial authorities. Jeremiah's guardianship documents, even if they were authentic, would have no legal standing in federal proceedings. The chief's revelation opened entirely new avenues for protecting Lucy, while also creating procedural complications that would require expert navigation of federal Indian law. However, establishing tribal jurisdiction will require formal recognition of Lucy's membership by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a process that normally takes several months and involves extensive documentation. We also face potential opposition from territorial officials who prefer to avoid federal intervention in local legal matters. Chief Running Bear's warning about bureaucratic delays indicated that tribal jurisdiction, while potentially decisive, would not provide immediate relief from Jeremiah's threats. There is another consideration that you must understand, Thomas Brennan. If Lucy is officially recognized as a tribal member, she will be subject to federal supervision and oversight that may limit your role in her upbringing. The federal government has been implementing policies designed to remove Indian children from tribal influences and place them in white institutions for cultural assimilation. The chief's concern about federal Indian policy revealed additional complications that could threaten Lucy's well-being even if they succeeded in defeating Jeremiah's claim. Meanwhile, Lucy was showing remarkable resilience and courage as she gradually recovered from the trauma of witnessing her mother's murder. Dr. Whitman had encouraged her to express her memories through drawing, and the results were providing powerful evidence that corroborated their medical and financial findings about Jeremiah's criminal activities. Lucy's artistic abilities were remarkable for a 9-year-old, but more importantly, her drawings provided detailed documentation of events that she had witnessed but been unable to discuss verbally. The pictures showed a progression of scenes that told a coherent story of systematic poisoning and deliberate murder with accuracy that was both impressive and heartbreaking. The first series of drawings depicted Jeremiah's visits to the Sullivan homestead, showing him carrying a small leather bag that he handled with particular care and kept separate from other possessions. Lucy had captured his furtive behavior with an intuitive understanding that was remarkable for someone so young. Subsequent drawings showed Jeremiah adding white powder to coffee cups and food preparations when Margaret wasn't looking, always maintaining a friendly demeanor while performing actions that the child somehow understood were dangerous and wrong. The duplicitous nature of his behavior was documented with observational skills that provided compelling evidence of premeditated murder. The final series of drawings depicted Margaret's progressive deterioration, showing her physical decline with the detailed attention of a child who had watched her mother die slowly and painfully. The chronological progression from health to sickness to death was documented with emotional precision that would be difficult for any defense attorney to dismiss or explain away. These drawings represent the testimony of an eyewitness to murder, Dr. Whitman explained as he reviewed Lucy's artistic documentation. While children's testimony is sometimes challenged in territorial courts, the consistency and medical accuracy of these images provide corroborating evidence that supports our scientific findings. But Lucy's recovery was complicated by Jeremiah's continued presence in their lives through court-mandated visitation rights that provided him with regular opportunities to continue his psychological intimidation. Every Sunday afternoon became an ordeal that tested everyone's resolve and reminded them that legal procedures could be used as weapons by criminals with sufficient resources and connections. During these visits, Jeremiah would speak to Lucy in tones that sounded affectionate to casual observers, but carried unmistakable threats that only she could fully understand. He would remind her of her family obligations, speak about the wonderful future they would share once legal matters were resolved, and make subtle references to her mother's death that reinforced his power over her continued survival. Thomas remained present during these sessions as required by Sheriff Garrett's order, but he was helpless to prevent the psychological torture that Jeremiah conducted through carefully chosen words and meaningful glances. Lucy would become increasingly agitated as Sunday afternoons approached, and the terror that these visits induced often triggered nightmares that lasted for days afterward. The situation was becoming unbearable, but any attempt to prevent the court-ordered visits would be used by Jeremiah to demonstrate Thomas's unreasonable interference with legitimate family relationships. The legal system that was supposed to protect Lucy was instead providing her tormentor with official sanction for continued intimidation. Jeremiah's campaign of intimidation and pressure was escalating beyond psychological warfare to include direct economic and physical threats designed to force Thomas's surrender through methods that remained technically legal but carried unmistakable messages about the consequences of continued resistance. The economic pressure intensified first, as suppliers and creditors throughout the territory received visits from well-dressed men who suggested that continued association with Thomas Brennan might prove financially disadvantageous. Feed suppliers began demanding immediate cash payments instead of extending the credit arrangements that had sustained ranch operations during difficult periods. The bank that held Thomas's mortgage received inquiries from potential investors about the property's availability and suggestions that the current owner's legal troubles made him a poor credit risk. Hardware stores and equipment dealers suddenly discovered inventory shortages, when Thomas attempted to purchase essential supplies, while competitors found themselves offered unusually favorable terms on goods and services that had previously been available to everyone on equal terms. The message was clear. Business relationships that had been built over years of mutual trust and fair dealing could be destroyed overnight by powerful interests with sufficient motivation and resources. Social pressure followed, as rumors began circulating throughout the community about Thomas's true motives for wanting to keep Lucy. Whispered conversations suggested that his interest in the child was motivated by greed rather than genuine concern, that he planned to exploit her inheritance for his own benefit, and that his bachelor status made him an inappropriate guardian for a young girl regardless of his stated intentions. The rumors were carefully crafted to exploit social tensions and prejudices that existed in any frontier community, playing on fears about male intentions toward vulnerable children and suspicions about sudden wealth that might corrupt previously honest men. Jeremiah understood that destroying Thomas's reputation would be as effective as legal maneuvering in achieving his ultimate goal of gaining control over Lucy and her inheritance. Church ladies who had previously treated Thomas with respect began crossing the street to avoid encounters that might compromise their social standing. Ranchers who had considered him a trusted neighbor started excluding him from cooperative ventures and informal gatherings where community business was conducted. The isolation was deliberate and systematic, designed to demonstrate the social consequences of opposing powerful interests. Physical intimidation appeared as well, subtle at first, but gradually becoming more obvious and threatening as Jeremiah realized that his opponents were more determined and better organized than he had initially expected. Ranch hands reported seeing strangers watching the property from distant ridgelines, men who disappeared when approached, but whose presence created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and potential danger. Tools and equipment began disappearing from barns and outbuildings, always items that were valuable enough to represent economic loss, but not significant enough that their theft would justify major investigation by territorial authorities. Harnesses vanished from tack rooms, hand tools disappeared from workshops, and small pieces of machinery were found damaged in ways that suggested deliberate sabotage rather than normal wear and tear. Cattle started wandering away from designated pastures, showing up miles from where they belonged in areas that required considerable effort and time to reach and retrieve them. Fences were found cut in remote locations where the damage wouldn't be discovered for days, allowing livestock to scatter and creating additional work that stretched ranch resources and personnel beyond their normal limits. The harassment campaign was designed to create mounting pressure that would eventually force Thomas to conclude that fighting Jeremiah's claim was more costly and dangerous than surrendering Lucy to her legitimate guardian. Each incident could be explained away as coincidence or normal frontier mishaps, but the cumulative effect was to create an atmosphere of siege that tested everyone's resolve and determination. On March 20th, the intimidation campaign escalated to direct violence when Thomas's main barn was set ablaze during the darkest hours of the night. The fire started in the hay storage area where dried grass and feed created perfect conditions for rapid combustion, and only Thomas's military-trained alertness prevented the loss of livestock that would have bankrupted the ranch operation. Thomas awakened to the smell of smoke and the sound of terrified horses, instantly recognizing the danger and responding with the quick decision-making that had kept him alive during the war. He roused his ranch hands and organized firefighting efforts while simultaneously preparing to defend against potential attacks on the main house where Lucy was sleeping. The battle to save the barn required 3 hours of dangerous work in conditions that could have killed anyone who made a mistake or hesitated at the wrong moment. Bucket brigades and wet blankets controlled the flames enough to allow evacuation of livestock, but the structure itself was lost along with the winter feed supply that would have sustained the cattle through the remaining months of harsh weather. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, Thomas found evidence that confirmed his suspicions about the fire's origin. Kerosene-soaked rags had been carefully placed to ensure maximum damage, and boot prints in the mud showed that multiple men had approached the barn from different directions before setting the blaze and disappearing into the darkness. This wasn't random vandalism, Thomas explained to Sheriff Garrett when he arrived to investigate the incident. Someone wanted to send a message about what happens to people who don't cooperate with certain business interests. But Sheriff Garrett was trapped by political pressures that prevented him from conducting the kind of aggressive investigation that the evidence clearly warranted. Territorial authorities had made it clear that they preferred to avoid conflicts with wealthy Eastern investors, and pursuing arson charges against Jeremiah's associates would inevitably lead to complications that could threaten careers and political relationships. 2 days after the barn fire, Thomas was riding the fence line when rifle shots began striking the ground around his horse, close enough to demonstrate deadly accuracy, but carefully aimed to intimidate rather than kill. The ambush had been planned with military precision, using natural terrain features to provide concealment while ensuring multiple escape routes for the attackers. Thomas's cavalry experience saved his life as he immediately recognized the tactical situation and responded with evasive maneuvers that made him a difficult target while allowing him to identify the shooter's positions. His return fire was accurate enough to wound at least one attacker, but the men escaped before he could pursue them effectively or gather evidence that would support criminal charges. The message was unmistakable. Thomas's life was forfeit if he continued to resist Jeremiah's claim, and future attacks might be designed to kill rather than simply intimidate. The stakes had escalated beyond legal proceedings to include the very real possibility of murder disguised as frontier violence that territorial authorities would be reluctant to investigate thoroughly. That evening, a note was found nailed to the ranch house door with a message that removed any ambiguity about Jeremiah's intentions. Give up the girl and leave the territory or die with her. You have 1 week to decide. The threat was explicit enough to justify federal intervention if territorial authorities could be convinced to request such assistance. But it was also vague enough that Jeremiah could deny direct involvement if challenged in legal proceedings. Thomas understood that the situation had reached a crisis point where normal legal procedures would be insufficient to protect Lucy or bring Jeremiah to justice. The corruption of territorial authorities and the scope of the criminal conspiracy required alternative strategies that could circumvent local officials and reach federal authorities with jurisdiction over interstate crimes. On March 25th, Thomas made the decision that would determine the outcome of their struggle against Jeremiah's criminal enterprise. He would travel to Helena to present their evidence directly to federal authorities while arranging for Lucy's protection through Chief Running Bear's tribal connections. The journey would be dangerous and the outcome uncertain, but remaining passive was no longer an option, given the escalating threats to their safety. I'm going to Helena to meet with U.S. Marshal Crawford, Thomas announced during their final strategy meeting at Jacob's Forge. Dr. Whitman's medical evidence, Pastor Morrison's document analysis, and Jacob's financial investigation should be enough to convince federal authorities that interstate crimes have been committed. The plan was risky because it would leave Lucy vulnerable to Jeremiah's direct action while Thomas was away, but Chief Running Bear had agreed to provide tribal protection that would be difficult for territorial authorities to challenge without creating federal complications. Marshal Crawford has been investigating Eastern mining companies for fraud and corruption, Thomas continued. Our evidence about Jeremiah's activities might provide the breakthrough he needs to build federal cases against the entire criminal network. Dr. Whitman nodded his agreement with the strategy. I've prepared detailed medical documentation that meets federal evidence standards. If Marshal Crawford is genuinely committed to stopping these crimes, our scientific findings should provide sufficient proof to justify arrests and federal prosecution. Pastor Morrison added his support for the plan while acknowledging its dangers. I'll remain here to monitor Jeremiah's activities and provide legal counsel if territorial authorities attempt to interfere with Lucy's tribal protection. My church connections might provide some influence with officials who respect religious authority. Jacob Ironwood's role would be to coordinate communications and ensure that Thomas received immediate notification if Jeremiah attempted direct action against Lucy during his absence. I've arranged relay riders who can carry messages between Helena and the reservation faster than official postal services. If trouble develops, you'll know within hours instead of days. Chief Running Bear's commitment was perhaps the most crucial element of the plan, as tribal sovereignty provided legal protections that territorial authorities would find difficult to challenge without risking federal intervention. The child will be safe on tribal lands under our protection, Chief Running Bear assured them. Federal treaties give us jurisdiction over our members, and Jeremiah's territorial connections cannot override federal law. As Thomas prepared for the dangerous journey to Helena, he understood that they were gambling everything on one final attempt to bring federal justice to bear on a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for too long. Success might save not just Lucy, but dozens of other potential victims throughout the territory. Failure would almost certainly result in Lucy's death and the continuation of Jeremiah's murderous activities under the protection of corrupt territorial officials. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether justice or criminality would prevail in a territory where wealth and political connections often mattered more than truth and human decency. Thomas's journey to Helena began before dawn on March 26th, with Dr. Whitman accompanying him to provide crucial medical testimony, while Pastor Morrison remained behind to monitor Jeremiah's increasingly dangerous activities. The ride would cover 80 miles of treacherous terrain through mountain passes still deadly with late winter snow, where ice-covered rocks could send horse and rider plummeting into ravines hundreds of feet deep, and the constant threat of avalanches required vigilance that could mean the difference between reaching their destination alive or becoming another cautionary tale about the perils of Montana winter travel. Thomas rode his best horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder that had carried him through countless cattle drives and possessed the intelligence and sure-footedness essential for navigating treacherous mountain terrain. Dr. Whitman rode alongside on his reliable mare, both men bundled in heavy wool coats and beaverskin hats that provided some protection against the cutting wind that howled through the peaks, with enough force to knock a man from his saddle if he wasn't prepared for its sudden gusts. The trail wound through passes carved by ancient glaciers, narrow defiles where towering granite walls rose on either side and the sky appeared as a thin ribbon of gray far above their heads. Snow had been falling intermittently for days, creating conditions where each step required careful consideration and a single moment of inattention could prove fatal. The horse's breath created clouds of vapor that froze instantly in the bitter air, and the men had to stop frequently to rest the animals and prevent the accumulation of ice in their nostrils that could suffocate them. U.S. Marshal Daniel Crawford maintained offices in the territorial capital, where federal authority could operate with measured independence from the corrupt local officials who had been systematically compromised by Eastern mining interests, wielding checkbooks and political influence like weapons. Crawford was 52 years old, a former Union cavalry colonel whose weathered face bore the permanent marks of battlefield leadership in frontier law enforcement in regions where justice was often determined by whoever possessed the most money, political connections, and willingness to employ violence without regard for moral consequences. The marshal's office occupied the second floor of a stone building that had been constructed to withstand both the harsh Montana climate and potential attacks by hostile forces. Heavy wooden shutters could be closed and barred against rifle fire, and the building's position provided commanding views of the surrounding streets that would allow defenders to observe approaching threats from multiple directions. Crawford had learned during the war that survival often depended on choosing defensive positions carefully and maintaining constant awareness of potential dangers. Marshal Crawford, Thomas began when they were finally admitted to his office after 2 days of persistent requests for meetings punctuated by increasingly urgent explanations of the life-threatening situation they were facing back at the ranch. We have comprehensive evidence of a criminal conspiracy that involves systematic murder, sophisticated document fraud, and extensive corruption of territorial officials at multiple levels of government throughout Montana Territory. Thomas spread their carefully assembled evidence across Crawford's desk with the methodical precision of a man who understood that their presentation might represent Lucy's only chance for survival and justice. The documentation included Dr. Whitman's medical findings, Pastor Morrison's analysis of forged documents, Jacob Ironwood's financial investigation, and Chief Running Bear's research into tribal lineage and federal treaty obligations that could provide alternative legal protections. The evidence includes definitive medical proof of systematic arsenic poisoning administered over a 3-month period, detailed analysis of forged legal papers that violate multiple federal statutes, and financial records showing direct payments from Eastern mining corporations to known criminals engaged in what we believe to be organized murder for profit. Dr. Whitman opened his medical bag and withdrew a collection of carefully preserved specimens that would provide irrefutable scientific proof of Margaret Sullivan's murder. Hair samples, fingernail clippings, and bone marrow extracts had been preserved according to the latest scientific methods and analyzed using chemical tests that could detect even trace amounts of arsenic poisoning months after death occurred. Crawford examined each piece of evidence with the methodical attention to detail that had made him successful in previous complex investigations involving powerful criminal organizations and corrupt officials who believed their wealth and political connections made them immune to federal prosecution. His expression grew increasingly grim as the scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprise became apparent through the accumulation of documentary proof. "Mr. Brennan," Crawford replied after spending nearly 2 hours carefully reviewing their comprehensive documentation and asking detailed questions about their investigation methods and the reliability of their sources, "what you've presented here provides crucial missing pieces to a puzzle I've been working on for over 3 years. Your Mr. Blackwood appears to be part of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that has been operating with apparent impunity across multiple territories while enjoying protection from corrupt officials at various levels of government." The marshal opened several thick file folders that contained reports from federal investigations in jurisdictions throughout the West, revealing for the first time the true scope of the criminal activities that had brought sustained governmental attention to mining fraud and related criminal enterprises that were threatening the stability and security of frontier communities across the rapidly expanding American frontier. Based on our extensive investigation involving federal agents and honest local law enforcement officers in 8 territories, Eastern mining companies have been systematically employing criminal organizations to acquire valuable properties through methods that include sophisticated document fraud, organized intimidation campaigns, systematic bribery of territorial officials, and what our accumulated evidence strongly suggests is carefully planned murder of property owners who refuse to cooperate with corporate acquisition efforts. Crawford methodically spread dozens of documents across his desk that clearly demonstrated a disturbing pattern of suspicious deaths followed by immediate property transfers, fraudulent inheritance claims, and subsequent sales to mining corporations at prices far below market value. The pattern extended far beyond Montana Territory into neighboring regions where similar crimes had been committed with what appeared to be complete impunity and official protection from corrupt territorial authorities. Our expanded federal investigation has now documented 37 cases in Colorado Territory alone, 28 in Dakota Territory, and 44 in Wyoming Territory. What began as 6 suspected cases has grown into evidence of systematic murder across 8 territories represented by men matching your Mr. Blackwood's description and operating methods. In every single case without exception, previously unknown relatives appeared immediately after the deaths with sophisticated legal documents establishing inheritance claims, then promptly sold the disputed properties to mining companies for substantial profits before disappearing to other territories where the pattern could be repeated. The shocking revelation that Margaret Sullivan's murder was merely one incident in a vast criminal conspiracy that had claimed dozens of lives provided both vindication for their dangerous investigation and sobering evidence of the powerful and ruthless forces they were confronting in their desperate fight for Lucy's safety and their broader quest for justice that could protect other innocent families from similar fates. Wyoming Territory has reported 44 similar cases following identical patterns. Dakota Territory has identified 28 additional cases, and we've received urgent requests for federal assistance from authorities in Nevada, California, and New Mexico territories about suspicious deaths that follow the same systematic template of murder, followed by fraudulent inheritance claims and immediate property transfers to corporate interests. Whitman leaned forward in his chair, his medical training helping him comprehend the staggering implications of such a widespread and methodical criminal conspiracy that specifically targeted innocent property owners throughout the frontier regions for systematic murder and theft on a scale that represented one of the largest criminal enterprises in American history. Marshal Crawford, are you telling us that we're dealing with an organized criminal network that has developed standardized procedures for murdering property owners and stealing their valuable holdings through sophisticated fraudulent legal mechanisms supported by extensive networks of corrupt territorial and federal officials who provide protection and official sanction for these criminal activities? Crawford nodded grimly, his expression reflecting both professional determination to see justice done and personal outrage at the scope of the criminal activities that his investigation had gradually uncovered through years of painstaking detective work and careful coordination with honest law enforcement officials throughout the Western Territories. That's exactly what our evidence conclusively demonstrates, Doctor. The total value of properties illegally acquired through these systematic criminal methods now exceeds $50 million across all affected territories, making this one of the largest and most sophisticated criminal conspiracies in American history. And based on the detailed medical documentation you have provided regarding systematic arsenic poisoning, we now have our first definitive scientific proof that supports our broader federal investigation. Meanwhile, back at the ranch and reservation, events were rapidly accelerating toward a dangerous crisis that would test everyone's courage, determination, and commitment to justice, while providing Jeremiah with what he desperately believed would be his final opportunity to seize control of Lucy before federal authorities could intervene to protect her from his increasingly frantic criminal schemes. Chief Running Bear had been conducting his own meticulous investigation into Lucy's heritage, working closely with tribal elders and federal records maintained by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to establish the strongest possible legal foundation that would provide comprehensive protection for the child under federal law and tribal sovereignty principles that superseded territorial jurisdiction in matters involving documented tribal members and their inherited property rights. The discovery of Lucy's Blackfoot ancestry through her grandmother White Dove opened entirely new legal possibilities that could provide protection from territorial corruption, but it also created complex jurisdictional issues that would require expert navigation of federal Indian law, tribal sovereignty questions, and the delicate balance between federal, territorial, and tribal authority in matters involving children's welfare and valuable property rights that various parties were attempting to claim through legal and illegal means. Thomas Brennan, Chief Running Bear, announced with formal ceremony when he arrived at the ranch, accompanied by two respected tribal elders, carrying elaborately decorated leather document cases that contained the results of weeks of careful research. I bring news that will fundamentally change the legal situation for the child you are protecting, but it will also create new challenges and responsibilities that you must be prepared to face with wisdom, courage, and deep respect for the cultural heritage that this discovery represents. The chief's formal manner and careful choice of words indicated the profound significance of what he was about to reveal, and his respectful acknowledgement of the complexities involved suggested that the legal and cultural implications would require thoughtful consideration and strategic planning by everyone involved in Lucy's protection and future welfare. Lucy Sullivan's maternal grandmother was White Dove, daughter of Chief Mountain Wind, who was a principal signatory to the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, and a respected leader whose wisdom and diplomatic skill helped establish peaceful relations between the Blackfoot Nation and the federal government. According to both carefully maintained tribal records and official federal documentation preserved by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, this heritage makes Lucy a legitimate member of the Blackfoot Nation with specific rights and protections that supersede territorial law and must be adjudicated through federal courts rather than territorial authorities. Chief Running Bear produced a comprehensive collection of documents that had been gathered from tribal archives, federal offices, and mission records, including birth certificates, marriage documents, tribal enrollment papers, and federal treaty documentation that established Lucy's lineage beyond any possible legal challenge, while demonstrating the meticulous record-keeping that tribal communities had maintained despite decades of governmental pressure and systematic attempts at cultural destruction. Under the explicit provisions of federal treaty law and constitutional principles governing the relationship between tribal nations and the federal government, property disputes involving documented tribal members must be handled exclusively through federal courts, with proper respect for tribal sovereignty and federal treaty obligations that have been recognized by the Supreme Court. Jeremiah's guardianship documents, even if they were completely authentic and properly executed, would have absolutely no legal standing whatsoever in federal proceedings involving tribal members and their inherited property rights. The chief's revelation opened entirely new avenues for protecting Lucy through federal jurisdiction, while also creating procedural complications that would require expert legal navigation and could potentially involve lengthy bureaucratic processes that might not provide immediate protection from the urgent threats that Jeremiah posed to Lucy's safety and welfare. However, establishing formal tribal jurisdiction and official recognition of Lucy's membership will require comprehensive documentation review and approval by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a complex bureaucratic process that normally requires several months of careful examination and involves extensive paperwork that must be processed through federal offices in Washington, where political considerations and competing interests can significantly delay even legitimate claims. Chief Running Bear's warning about bureaucratic complications indicated that tribal jurisdiction, while potentially decisive in the long term and legally unassailable once established, would not provide the immediate relief from urgent threats that Lucy's desperate situation required, given Jeremiah's escalating criminal activities and apparent willingness to use violence to achieve his goals. There is another serious consideration that you must understand and prepare for, Thomas Brennan, because it may significantly affect your relationship with Lucy and your role in her future upbringing and education. If Lucy is officially recognized as a tribal member under federal law, she will become subject to federal supervision and oversight through the Bureau of Indian Affairs that may substantially limit your authority in decisions about her care, education, and cultural development. The chief's concern about federal Indian policy revealed additional complications that could threaten Lucy's family stability and emotional well-being, even if they succeeded in defeating Jeremiah's criminal claims and protecting her from immediate physical danger. Because federal policies were specifically designed to separate Indian children from traditional influences and place them in institutions that would eliminate their cultural identity through forced assimilation. During this period of mounting legal tension and increasingly dangerous threats, Lucy was demonstrating remarkable personal resilience and mature courage that amazed the adults who were working to protect her, gradually recovering from the severe psychological trauma of witnessing her mother's systematic murder while simultaneously facing the terrifying prospect of falling into the hands of the man directly responsible for her family's destruction and her current desperate circumstances. Dr. Whitman had encouraged Lucy to express her traumatic memories and complex emotions through artistic creation as a form of therapeutic treatment, and the results were providing not only significant psychological benefits for the child, but also powerful legal evidence that corroborated their medical and financial findings about Jeremiah's extensive criminal activities and the systematic nature of his murderous scheme to steal her valuable inheritance through fraud and intimidation. Lucy's artistic abilities were truly remarkable for a 9-year-old child who had received only basic education in a frontier environment, but more importantly, from a legal and investigative perspective, her detailed drawings provided comprehensive visual documentation of events that she had personally witnessed but had been psychologically unable to discuss verbally due to the severe trauma that such horrific experiences had inflicted on someone so young and vulnerable. The pictures showed a clear chronological progression of carefully observed scenes that told a coherent and legally compelling story of systematic poisoning and deliberate murder, with an accuracy and attention to detail that was both impressive from an artistic standpoint and heartbreaking from a human perspective, as evidence of the unimaginable suffering this child had been forced to endure while watching her mother die slowly and painfully. The first series of drawings depicted Jeremiah's regular visits to the Sullivan homestead over a period of several months, showing him consistently carrying a distinctive small leather bag that he handled with particular care and suspicious secrecy, always keeping it separate from his other possessions and never allowing Margaret to examine its contents or even come close to it during his visits. Lucy had captured his furtive behavior and deliberately deceptive activities with an intuitive understanding that was remarkable for someone so young, documenting patterns of suspicious conduct that trained adult investigators might have overlooked or failed to recognize as evidence of criminal intent and systematic preparation for murder. Subsequent drawings showed Jeremiah systematically adding white powder to coffee cups, tea preparations, and food dishes when Margaret wasn't looking or was temporarily absent from the room, always maintaining a friendly and caring demeanor while performing actions that the child somehow understood were dangerous and potentially deadly, despite her inability to fully comprehend the murderous nature of what she was witnessing. The duplicitous nature of his behavior was documented with exceptional observational skills that provided compelling evidence of premeditated murder carried out over an extended period with calculated cruelty designed to cause maximum suffering while avoiding detection by authorities who might investigate if Margaret's death appeared sudden or obviously unnatural. The final series of drawings depicted Margaret's progressive physical deterioration in heartbreaking detail, showing her gradual decline from robust health to weakness to severe illness to death with the careful attention of a loving child who had watched her mother die slowly and painfully while being completely powerless to help or even fully understand what was happening to the most important person in her young life. These drawings represent detailed testimony from an eyewitness to systematic murder, Dr. Whitman explained as he reviewed Lucy's artistic documentation with the objective professional perspective of someone trained to evaluate evidence according to scientific standards. While children's testimony can sometimes be challenged in territorial courts due to questions about reliability and potential coaching, by interested parties, the medical accuracy and consistent detail of these images provide powerful corroborating evidence that supports our scientific findings and financial investigation. The drawings also revealed Lucy's exceptional intelligence and emotional strength, demonstrating that despite the severe trauma she had endured, she possessed the psychological resilience and mental clarity necessary to serve as a credible witness whose testimony could help convict the criminals responsible for her mother's death and protect other potential victims from similar fates. But Lucy's gradual recovery and growing confidence were severely complicated and threatened by Jeremiah's continued menacing presence in their lives through court-mandated visitation rights that provided him with regular opportunities to continue his psychological intimidation and emotional abuse while maintaining the legal pretense of familial concern and appropriate interest in his supposed niece's welfare and proper upbringing. Every Sunday afternoon became a dreaded ordeal that tested everyone's emotional strength and resolve, while serving as a stark reminder that legal procedures could be skillfully manipulated and used as weapons by criminals with sufficient resources, political connections, and sophisticated knowledge of how to exploit systemic vulnerabilities in frontier justice systems that were ill-equipped to deal with such complex criminal conspiracies. During these supervised visits, Jeremiah would speak to Lucy in tones that sounded appropriately affectionate and caring to casual observers, but carried unmistakable threats and intimidation that only she could fully understand based on her intimate knowledge of his true character and direct experience with his criminal activities and capacity for violence. He would remind her repeatedly of her supposed family obligations and duties to blood relatives, speak in elaborate detail about the wonderful future and exciting opportunities they would share once legal matters were properly resolved in his favor, and make subtle but unmistakable references to her mother's death and his role in it that reinforced his power over her continued survival and served as constant reminders of what he was capable of doing to people who opposed his will. Thomas remained physically present during these sessions as specifically required by Sheriff Garrett's court order, but he was legally powerless to prevent the psychological torture that Jeremiah conducted through carefully chosen words, meaningful glances, and subtle gestures that conveyed deadly threats without providing legal grounds for intervention or violation of visitation agreements that had been established by territorial court authority. Lucy would become increasingly agitated and emotionally distressed as Sunday afternoons approached each week, often experiencing anxiety attacks and sleeping difficulties that began several days before each scheduled visit, and the psychological trauma that these encounters induced would frequently trigger severe nightmares and panic episodes that lasted for several days afterward, systematically undoing much of the therapeutic progress she had made during the intervening periods when she felt safe and protected. On March 28th, while Thomas was still traveling toward Helena through dangerous mountain passes, the situation escalated dramatically and dangerously when Jeremiah arrived at the reservation with what appeared to be comprehensive federal authority to take immediate custody of Lucy and arrest anyone who attempted to interfere with his legal rights and parental authority as her closest living relative. He was accompanied by a substantial force, including territorial deputies and several men claiming to be federal marshals who carried official-looking documentation that had apparently been specifically designed to overwhelm any potential resistance through the sheer weight of governmental authority and the threat of federal prosecution for anyone who dared to oppose what appeared to be legitimate law enforcement actions backed by proper court orders and federal warrants. Chief Running Bear, Jeremiah announced with supreme confidence as he dismounted from his horse with theatrical precision clearly intended to intimidate and impress the tribal officials who had been protecting Lucy. I have here official federal warrants for the immediate arrest of Thomas Brennan on serious federal charges, including kidnapping, interference with interstate commerce, obstruction of justice, and violation of multiple federal court orders issued by competent federal judicial authority. The fraudulent federal warrants that Jeremiah presented with such confidence were extremely sophisticated forgeries that had been created through his extensive network of corrupt officials who had access to proper forms, official seals, and detailed knowledge of federal legal procedures. But they appeared sufficiently authentic to convince honest law enforcement officers who had no reason to suspect such elaborate criminal deception and who were naturally inclined to cooperate with apparently legitimate federal authority. Lucy belongs with her legitimate family, according to both territorial and federal law, and federal statutes explicitly require tribal authorities to surrender fugitives who are wanted on valid federal charges without delay or procedural complications. I'm here to take my beloved niece to her proper home where she belongs and to ensure that Thomas Brennan finally faces appropriate justice for his serious crimes against our family in violation of federal law. Jeremiah's carefully rehearsed performance was polished and convincing, specifically designed to exploit the natural tendency of law enforcement officers to avoid complex jurisdictional conflicts while cooperating with what appeared to be superior federal authority, backed by proper legal documentation, and supported by armed federal officers with authority to make arrests and use force if necessary to execute their official duties. Chief Running Bear's response demonstrated both the legal sovereignty that tribal status provided under federal treaties and the diplomatic wisdom that was absolutely required to navigate extremely complex legal situations without triggering violent confrontations that could result in unnecessary deaths, permanent damage to tribal-federal relations, and potential military intervention that could threaten the safety and welfare of his entire community. I will examine these federal warrants with extreme care and consult immediately with tribal legal counsel and federal authorities in Washington before making any decisions about compliance with what you claim are legitimate federal directives, Chief Running Bear declared, with the calm but unmistakable authority of someone who understood that hasty decisions made under pressure could have permanent and devastating consequences for everyone involved. Federal law requires proper verification procedures and careful review even in supposedly urgent situations involving tribal sovereignty and children's welfare. The chief's insistence on following established legal procedures forced Jeremiah to either wait patiently for thorough examination of his fraudulent documents or reveal his true criminal nature through threats of violence against tribal officials who were operating completely within their legal rights and federal treaty obligations that had been recognized by Congress and the Supreme Court. While we conduct a comprehensive review of these documents and verify their authenticity and proper legal authority, the child will remain safely under tribal protection as explicitly guaranteed by federal treaties that supersede any other legal considerations or competing claims to jurisdiction. If these warrants prove to be authentic and properly issued by competent federal authority, we will fully comply with legitimate federal law. If they prove to be fraudulent or improperly issued, we will treat this as an attempted kidnapping and respond with appropriate force to protect the child and tribal sovereignty. Chief Running Bear's measured response provided precious time for Thomas to return from Helena with genuine federal support and proper legal authority, while also establishing clear and reasonable boundaries that protected Lucy from immediate danger without unnecessarily provoking violent confrontation that could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. During the tense hours that followed, as both sides waited for resolution of the jurisdictional dispute, Lucy demonstrated extraordinary personal courage by volunteering to testify directly about her experiences and confront the man who had murdered her mother, understanding that her voice might be the most powerful weapon available for fighting Jeremiah's criminal scheme and protecting other potential victims from similar fates. "I want to tell everyone exactly what Jeremiah did to my mama," Lucy announced with surprising firmness when the situation reached its most dangerous point and it appeared that violence might be inevitable. "I'm not afraid of him anymore, and I want people to know the truth about what kind of man he really is and what he's capable of doing to innocent people." Lucy's transformation from terrorized victim to determined witness represented a crucial turning point in her psychological recovery and provided hope that justice might ultimately prevail despite the extensive corruption and criminal influence that had infected territorial legal systems and threatened to protect murderers from the consequences of their crimes. The crisis reached its dramatic climax when Thomas returned from Helena with USS Marshall Crawford and properly issued federal warrants that would expose Jeremiah's entire criminal enterprise and bring genuine federal justice to bear on a situation that had been manipulated and corrupted by criminals with extensive resources and political connections. Their arrival completely transformed the dangerous standoff from a confusing jurisdictional dispute into a straightforward federal criminal investigation with clear legal authority and proper documentation. Jeremiah Blackwood, also known as Jerome Blackwell, Marshall Crawford announced with full federal authority, as genuine federal agents quickly and efficiently surrounded the group of territorial deputies and fraudulent marshals, cutting off all escape routes and establishing complete control over the situation. You are under arrest for interstate fraud, conspiracy to commit multiple murders, systematic corruption of federal officials, impersonation of federal law enforcement officers, violations of federal treaty obligations, and numerous other federal crimes that carry severe penalties, including potential execution for murder. The arrest of Jeremiah and his criminal associates marked the dramatic culmination of a complex federal investigation that had revealed extensive criminal activities involving some of the most powerful economic interests in the country and corrupt officials at multiple levels of government who had been systematically protecting and facilitating criminal activities in exchange for substantial financial compensation and political favors. Dr. Whitman's comprehensive medical evidence has been reviewed by federal experts and independent laboratories who conclusively confirm systematic arsenic poisoning in this case and 34 similar cases across 8 territories. Our investigation has identified a criminal network directly responsible for systematic murders committed for massive financial gain through one of the most sophisticated and dangerous criminal enterprises in American history. Marshall Crawford's announcement provided complete vindication for everyone who had courageously risked their safety, reputation, and financial security to protect Lucy and expose the truth about Margaret's murder and the broader criminal conspiracy that had threatened innocent families throughout the frontier regions and represented a direct assault on the rule of law and civilized society. The federal trial that followed over the subsequent months would expose the complete scope of the criminal conspiracy and result in convictions and sentences that sent shockwaves throughout territorial business communities and eastern mining corporations that had either participated directly in criminal activities or benefited from the systematic murder and theft that had characterized the criminal enterprise's operations. Jerome Blackwell was revealed to be a professional killer and confidence man who had operated across multiple territories using various false identities and forged documents while maintaining connections to corrupt officials who provided protection and official sanction for his criminal activities in exchange for substantial financial compensation and shares in the profits from stolen properties. His extensive connections to the Consolidated Mining Corporation and other Eastern business interests led to additional federal arrests and prosecutions that systematically dismantled a criminal network that had operated with apparent impunity for years, while terrorizing frontier communities and undermining confidence in territorial legal systems and governmental institutions. Major Twist 5, the mining consortium fully exposed. Federal investigators discovered that the criminal enterprise extended far beyond individual property theft to include systematic manipulation of territorial land offices, corruption of federal survey teams, fraudulent mining claims that had stolen millions of acres of public land, and political bribery that reached into Congress and federal agencies responsible for territorial administration. Railroad companies were found to be complicit in the scheme, using their massive political influence and financial resources to ensure that law enforcement investigations were suppressed, misdirected, or undermined through bureaucratic obstruction and intimidation of honest officials. The investigation revealed that over 100 properties worth more than $60 million had been illegally acquired through systematic murder, fraud, and corruption, making it the largest criminal conspiracy in American history and demonstrating the extent to which corporate interests were willing to use violence and corruption to achieve their financial goals without regard for human life or legal constraints. Major Twist 6. Lucy's Blackfoot heritage, confirmed and expanded. The Bureau of Indian Affairs investigation not only confirmed Lucy's tribal status, but revealed that her grandmother's original land grant included mineral rights covering over 50,000 acres that had been illegally transferred to mining companies through fraudulent documentation and corruption of federal land office officials. This discovery invalidated numerous mining claims, restored tribal control over vast areas of traditional Blackfoot territory, and established legal precedents that would protect other tribal communities from similar exploitation and theft. The revelation also exposed systematic violations of federal treaty obligations by territorial officials who had been bribed to ignore tribal rights and facilitate corporate land grabs that violated constitutional principles and federal law, leading to additional prosecutions and the removal of corrupt officials throughout the territorial government system. Hook 8. The Territorial Hearing and Community Reconciliation. Judge Mackenzie, realizing that his court and his own reputation had been manipulated and compromised by criminals who had exploited his trust in legal authority, convened an extraordinary public hearing in the town hall where over 200 citizens gathered to witness comprehensive testimony about the criminal conspiracy that had threatened their entire community and undermined confidence in their legal institutions. The community that had been systematically divided and manipulated by Jeremiah's sophisticated psychological warfare and deliberate spreading of false rumors came together in unanimous support of justice and truth, formally apologizing to Thomas and Lucy for their earlier suspicions and misplaced hostility while promising to ensure that such extensive corruption and criminal manipulation could never again threaten their community's safety. The Sacred Mountain confrontation at Eagle's Nest Peak. When Jeremiah's remaining criminal associates learned about the federal investigation and realized that their entire network was being systematically dismantled, they attempted to eliminate key witnesses before the trial could proceed, pursuing Lucy and her tribal protectors to Eagle's Nest Peak, a sacred Blackfoot site located high in the mountains where spiritual ceremonies had been conducted for generations. During a fierce spring blizzard that reduced visibility to mere yards and created life-threatening conditions for anyone exposed to the elements, Thomas and tribal warriors fought a desperate running battle against heavily armed professional killers who had planted explosives throughout the sacred site in a final attempt to destroy all evidence of their criminal activities and eliminate anyone who could testify against them in federal court. The confrontation reached its climax when Jeremiah himself appeared at the sacred cave where Lucy was hidden, demanding her surrender and threatening to detonate the explosives that would kill everyone on the mountain unless his demands were met immediately and unconditionally. In the final hand-to-hand combat that followed, Thomas fought Jeremiah on a narrow mountain ledge while wind and snow created conditions where a single misstep would mean certain death. The battle ended when Jeremiah, weakened by years of dissolute living and lacking Thomas's military training and physical conditioning, lost his footing during a desperate attack and fell to his death on the rocks hundreds of feet below, while his surviving associates surrendered as federal reinforcements arrived after fighting their way through the blizzard to reach the sacred mountain. Lucy's complete transformation and family formation. Lucy's remarkable evolution from traumatized victim to confident survivor and courageous witness culminated in her conscious decision to legally take the name Lucy Brennan Sullivan, deliberately choosing to honor both her chosen father and her birth mother while establishing her own identity as someone who had survived terrible trauma and emerged stronger and more determined to protect others from similar suffering. Her exceptional courage in testifying at the federal trial, where she provided clear and detailed testimony about witnessing her mother's murder and Jeremiah's systematic criminal activities, helped ensure the conviction of the entire criminal network and established important legal precedents that would protect other vulnerable families from similar exploitation and violence in the future. The community healing that followed her testimony demonstrated the remarkable power of truth and courage to overcome even the most sophisticated criminal deception and systematic manipulation. As neighbors who had been turned against each other by Jeremiah's deliberate spreading of false rumors and malicious gossip rediscovered their shared values and created stronger bonds of mutual trust and support than had existed before the crisis tested their character and resolve. Generational legacy, comprehensive time progression from 1876 to 1910. Lucy's growth from traumatized 9-year-old child to accomplished and respected woman was marked by significant milestones that demonstrated her exceptional character and the positive influence of Thomas's guidance and the community's support once they understood the truth about her situation and the criminal conspiracy that had threatened them all. In 1885, at age 18, Lucy graduated from the Territorial Teachers College with highest honors and special recognition for her essay on justice and the protection of vulnerable citizens, which was published in territorial newspapers and helped establish her reputation as an intelligent and articulate advocate for social reform and legal improvements. In 1892, she married James Morrison, Pastor Morrison's nephew, who had returned from Eastern Law School to establish a practice in Montana, in a ceremony that beautifully blended Christian and Blackfoot traditions and symbolized the cultural bridge that Lucy represented between different communities and ways of life. Their first child, a son they named Thomas in honor of his adoptive grandfather, was born in 1895, followed by two daughters in 1801 and 1900. Throughout this period of family growth and personal happiness, Lucy used her inherited wealth responsibly and generously, establishing schools that served both white and Blackfoot children, funding medical facilities that provided free treatment to families who couldn't afford private care, and creating a legal assistance foundation that provided professional help to families threatened by corporate land grabs and similar exploitation. By 1900, Lucy had become one of the most respected women in Montana Territory, known throughout the region for her intelligence, generosity, unwavering commitment to justice, and ability to bring together different communities in pursuit of common goals. She served on the Territorial Council for Women's Rights and was instrumental in Montana's successful statehood process, using her influence and resources to ensure that the new state constitution included strong protections for individual rights and tribal sovereignty. The copper mines on her property were developed through carefully negotiated partnerships with tribal authorities that ensured environmental protection, fair wages for all workers regardless of race or background, and respect for the cultural and spiritual significance that the land held for the Blackfoot people, establishing a model for responsible resource development that other companies were encouraged to follow. Physical legacy, tangible achievements, and community development. By 1910, the Brennan Ranch had expanded through careful management and strategic land purchases to encompass over 5,000 acres of prime Montana grassland, making it one of the most successful and profitable ranching operations in the territory while maintaining the highest standards of animal care and environmental stewardship that had been established during Thomas's early years of operation. Lucy had used her copper mining profits to fund the construction of 3 modern schools equipped with the latest educational materials and teaching methods, 2 hospitals that provided advanced medical care using the most current techniques and equipment, and a public library that served the entire region and housed one of the most comprehensive collections of books and periodicals west of the Mississippi River. The ranch employed over 30 full-time workers year-round and provided seasonal employment for dozens more during cattle drives and harvest seasons, becoming a model of responsible business practices and fair labor relations that demonstrated how successful enterprises could benefit entire communities rather than just wealthy owners. Spiritual legacy, values, and principles passed through generations. The fundamental values that Thomas had taught Lucy through his example and guidance: courage in the face of danger, honesty even when truth was difficult or costly, compassion for those who suffered, an unwavering commitment to justice regardless of personal risk, were carefully passed down to her children and influenced countless other families throughout the region who looked to the Brennan family as an example of how to live with integrity and purpose. The music box became much more than a family heirloom. It evolved into a powerful symbol of survival and the ultimate triumph of truth over deception, displayed in a place of honor in their home where it served as a daily reminder to each new generation of the price of freedom and the critical importance of standing up for what is right, even when powerful forces oppose justice and threaten those who dare to speak truth. Cemetery scene, honoring the past and teaching the future. On a warm spring day in 1910, 3 generations of the Brennan family made their annual pilgrimage to the cemetery where Margaret Sullivan was buried alongside Thomas's first wife Catherine and daughter Annie, creating a sacred space where the living honored the dead and learned from their sacrifices and examples. Lucy, now 43 and carrying the dignified bearing of a woman who had survived terrible trauma and built a meaningful life through determination and the support of people who chose to love and protect her, placed fresh flowers on all 3 graves while teaching her 10-year-old son Michael about the importance of remembering those who had come before and honoring their sacrifices through lives lived with purpose and integrity. These women, Lucy explained to her son as they knelt together in the peaceful quiet of the cemetery, taught us the most important lesson anyone can learn, that family is about love and choice and mutual commitment, not just biological relationships or legal documents. Your great-grandmother Catherine and Aunt Annie welcomed my mother and me into their family even though we never met them in life. And my mother's sacrifice and buffering ensured that you would grow up free from the fear and danger that once threatened our family's very existence. Thomas, now 77 but still strong in spirit and sharp in mind, despite the physical limitations that age had imposed on his once powerful frame, added his own perspective with the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had learned the true meaning of legacy through decades of experience and careful observation of life's deepest truths and most important lessons. Michael, he said as he placed his weathered hand on his grandson's shoulder, the most important inheritance we can give you isn't money or land or property, though those things certainly matter and carry their own responsibilities. It's the understanding that every generation has a sacred responsibility to protect the vulnerable and stand up courageously for justice, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against what's right and true. In the frame story's emotional conclusion, Old Thomas finished his comprehensive account by emphasizing the eternal nature of the struggle between good and evil, and the personal responsibility that each individual bears for choosing which side to support through their daily actions, decisions, and moral choices that define their character and determine their legacy. The music box still plays the same beautiful song after all these years, Thomas said as the haunting melody filled the warm room with its timeless beauty and its connection to a heritage that transcended individual lives and connected past, present, and future. Because some truths are eternal and some bonds of love are unbreakable by time or distance or even death itself. Your Aunt Lucy and I found each other during the worst blizzard in Montana's history, when both our lives seemed hopeless and our futures appeared bleak. And that meeting created a family that has lasted through decades of challenge and change, prosperity and hardship, joy and sorrow, because it was built on foundations of love, choice, and shared commitment to protecting what matters most. Michael's understanding and commitment to the future. The 10-year-old boy sat quietly for several long minutes, carefully absorbing the full weight of the story and beginning to comprehend the profound legacy of courage, integrity, and moral responsibility that was now his inheritance and his obligation to carry forward into an uncertain future that would present its own challenges and demand its own acts of courage and commitment to justice. His thoughtful questions demonstrated a mature grasp of the story's deeper meanings and revealed a developing determination to live up to the example set by previous generations who had faced their own tests and emerged victorious through persistence, courage, and unwavering commitment to truth and justice. Grandpa, Michael said with the seriousness of someone who understood that important conversations required careful thought and honest expression, will I be tested the way you and Aunt Lucy were tested? Will I have to choose between what's easy and comfortable and what's right and just? Thomas smiled with the deep satisfaction of someone who had successfully passed on the most important lessons that life had taught him through experience, sacrifice, and careful observation of human nature in all its complexity and potential for both good and evil. Every generation faces its own tests, Michael, and yours will be no exception. The specific details and circumstances will change, but the fundamental choices remain the same throughout history. You'll have opportunities to help people who can't help themselves, to speak truth when lies are more convenient and profitable, and to build something lasting and meaningful instead of just taking whatever you can get for yourself. And when those moments come, and they will come because they always do for people who choose to live with purpose and meaning. Remember this story and choose the path that leads to justice and love and truth, even when it's difficult and dangerous and costly. That's how each generation honors those who came before and creates a foundation for those who will come after. Visual closure and final reflection. As the evening concluded and the family prepared to retire for the night, the camera would slowly pan across family photographs spanning 34 years of growth, prosperity, and happiness that had grown from the small seeds of courage and love planted during that terrible winter of 1876, when a dying woman's desperate last words had changed everything for a lonely rancher and a terrified child who found each other in the darkness of a winter storm. The music box melody would continue softly in the background, its haunting beauty serving as a bridge between past and present, while snow fell gently outside the warm windows, symbolizing both the cyclical nature of seasons and challenges, and the enduring warmth and security that love and justice could create even in the harshest circumstances and most difficult times. The story's final image would be of three generations holding hands around the dinner table in a circle of love and commitment, united by bonds stronger than blood and deeper than law, committed to carrying forward the values and principles that had transformed personal tragedy into community triumph and created a lasting legacy from what had begun as a temporary crisis that tested everyone's character and resolve. In that final moments of quiet reflection, with the snow falling outside and the fire burning warmly in the hearth, the eternal message of the story would be complete, that families are created by choice and love rather than accident and biology, that justice requires courage and sacrifice from ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things, and that every generation has the opportunity and responsibility to build something better for those who will follow, regardless of how difficult the circumstances or how powerful the forces arrayed against what is right and true and good. As the evening drew to its close, Thomas carefully lifted the music box from the table, his weathered fingers finding the familiar winding mechanism. The gentle melody began to play, that haunting Blackfoot lullaby that had survived decades of change and challenge, its notes floating through the warm room like a benediction. Lucy rose to help her son prepare for bed, but Michael lingered, watching his grandfather's face in the firelight as the music continued its ancient song. "Grandpa," he said softly, "I understand now. The music box isn't just about remembering the past. It's about carrying the best parts forward." Thomas nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears of pride and satisfaction. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Montana, now a state rather than a territory, covering the land with the same white peace that had once brought death and salvation in equal measure. But inside the Brennan home, three generations sat connected by bonds stronger than blood, warmed by love deeper than law, united in their commitment to honor the past while building toward a future worthy of those who would come after them. The music box played on, its melody a promise that some truths endure forever, that some love transcends even death itself, and that every ending is also a beginning for those who have the courage to listen to its song.